Walk down the frozen aisle in an American grocery store, and sitting right next to the ice cream, often in nearly identical packaging, at a noticeably lower price, you'll find products that never actually use the word ice cream on the label at all. Frozen dairy dessert. Frozen dessert, sometimes just a brand name with no category descriptor in sight. That's not an accident, and it's not a marketing choice made freely, because in the United States it is the law. A product that doesn't meet a specific federally defined compositional standard is not legally allowed to call itself ice cream, no matter how much it looks, scoops, and tastes like it. This video is a little different from most of what we've covered so far, because this time the US actually has the stricter, more rigid, more centrally enforced standard, and the EU's regulatory picture is genuinely more fragmented and inconsistent by comparison. It's a good reminder that this channel isn't built around a simple Europe strict, America lax formula. Sometimes the story runs the other way, and ice cream is one of the clearest examples of that. Let's start with the US standard, because it's remarkably specific for something most people assume is basically unregulated. Under the FDA's standard of identity for ice cream, a product has to meet several defined thresholds simultaneously to legally use the word ice cream on its label. It needs a minimum of 10% milk fat by weight. It needs a minimum amount of total milk solids beyond just the fat. And in a requirement most people have genuinely never heard of, it has to meet a minimum weight of 4.5 pounds per gallon. That weight per gallon rule exists specifically to address something called overrun, the industry term for how much air gets whipped into ice cream during the freezing and churning process. Air is essentially free, and incorporating more of it into a batch of ice cream base means you get more finished volume out of the same amount of actual dairy ingredients, which is a straightforward way to cut ingredient costs per gallon sold. Without some kind of floor on finished product density, a manufacturer could theoretically whip enormous amounts of air into a base and sell mostly air with a thin coating of actual ice cream flavor and texture around it. The federal minimum weight requirement exists specifically to prevent that from happening at the extreme end by setting a floor on how light and therefore how air heavy a product can be while still using the word ice cream. It's also worth digging a little deeper into what overrun actually looks like at the extremes, because the range between a budget product and a premium one is bigger than most shoppers realize. Some mass market ice cream is produced at close to the maximum overrun that still technically clears the federal weight per gallon floor, meaning close to half of the finished product's volume can be air rather than actual ice cream base, churned in specifically to stretch a fixed batch of dairy ingredients into as many sellable containers as legally possible. Ultra-premium brands, by contrast, often specifically market overrun figures closer to the low double digits or even less, meaning the product is close to solid ice cream base with comparatively little air worked in at all. Both products can legally be called ice cream under the same federal standard, since both clear the same minimum thresholds. The standard sets a floor, not a fixed target, which is exactly why two products carrying the identical category name on their packaging can still differ this dramatically in how much of what you're actually paying for is dairy versus air. Here's where the practical difference between products actually starts to show up, though, and it's genuinely something you can check yourself without any special equipment. Even within the range that legally qualifies as ice cream, overrun varies enormously between budget and premium brands. Cheaper, high-volume ice cream typically runs on the higher end of allowable overrun, meaning more air, a lighter, fluffier texture, and a pint container that, if you actually weighed it, would come in notably lighter than a premium brand's pint of the exact same stated volume. Premium ice cream brands market their density directly, sometimes explicitly advertising a specific low overrun percentage, because a denser product, weight for weight, delivers meaningfully more actual dairy fat and flavor per bite, which is part of why it costs more and tastes richer, independent of any difference in the recipe's flavor ingredients themselves. Now, what happens when a product falls short of that 10% milk fat threshold or uses a fat source other than dairy fat entirely? It has to be labeled differently, and the specific tier depends on exactly what's different about the formulation. Products with reduced fat dairy fat, but still meeting other dairy-based requirements, typically use terms like reduced fat, light, or low fat ice cream, each tied to a specific defined fat reduction relative to a standard reference product, similar in structure to how light is defined for other packaged foods under FDA labeling rules. Products that swap dairy fat out for vegetable oil or other non-dairy fat sources entirely generally fall into the broader frozen dairy dessert category, or in some cases just frozen dessert if dairy content drops further still. There's a genuinely strange, specifically American historical quirk buried in this labeling system worth knowing about, a legal category called mellorine, which is specifically defined and in several states directly regulated at the state level rather than just under general FDA rules, as a frozen dessert made with vegetable fat instead of dairy fat, mimicking ice cream's texture and use but explicitly not allowed to be called ice cream because of that fat substitution. Some southern U.S. states in particular have their own specific mellorine regulations dating back decades, a regulatory relic from a period when vegetable oil-based ice cream substitutes were a bigger part of the market than they are today, but the legal category and the requirement that it be labeled and sold under that specific name rather than as ice cream still technically exists. It's a good reminder that federal rules aren't always the whole picture in the U.S. either. State-level food categories like this one can sit alongside the federal standard of identity, adding an extra layer of specificity that most shoppers, and honestly most people working in the food industry outside that specific product category, have never had a reason to encounter. It is worth understanding why the FDA built such a specific multi-part standard in the first place, because it was not an arbitrary bureaucratic decision. It traces back to a genuinely well-documented history of ice cream adulteration in the early 20th century, well before federal food standards existed in any comprehensive form. Before this kind of standard was established, it was common for manufacturers to stretch ice cream with cheap fillers, excessive air, and in some historical cases, outright substitute ingredients, selling the result to consumers with no reliable way to know what they were actually buying. The multi-part standard, minimum fat, minimum milk solids, minimum weight per gallon, all required simultaneously rather than any single threshold alone, was specifically designed to close off multiple different ways a manufacturer might otherwise cut corners at once, since a producer trying to game just one requirement, say by hitting the fat percentage while loading up on air to save on total dairy content, would still get caught by the separate weight per gallon floor working as an independent check. The standard also regulates stabilizers and emulsifiers, ingredients like guar gum, carrageenan, and cellulose gum that help control ice crystal formation and give ice cream its smooth, scoopable texture over time in the freezer rather than turning into a solid icy block. United States regulation caps how much of these stabilizing ingredients can be used, generally around 0.5% of total product weight, specifically to prevent a manufacturer from using large amounts of cheap thickening agents to fake a rich, smooth texture without the actual dairy fat content to back it up. The European Union permits a broadly similar range of stabilizing ingredients in frozen desserts generally, though consistent with the more fragmented compositional picture we are about to get into, without one single harmonized European Union-wide cap, the way the United States applies specifically to products carrying the ice cream name. Now let's look at the European side of this, because it's genuinely a different kind of story than most of what we've covered on this channel. Unlike butter, where the European Union has one clear, harmonized, European Union-wide minimum fat percentage that applies uniformly across all member states, ice cream does not have an equivalent single, centrally mandated European Union compositional standard in the same way. The European Union's General Food Information Regulation requires that labeling be accurate and not misleading, and prohibits deceptive claims broadly across all food categories, but it does not set one specific harmonized minimum milk fat percentage that a product must hit before it is legally allowed to use the word ice cream across the entire European Union the way the Food and Drug Administration's standard of identity does for the United States market. Instead, compositional expectations for ice cream have historically been left more to individual member states, industry codes of practice, and national consumer protection traditions, which means the practical definition of what counts as real ice cream can vary more from country to country within Europe than you might expect, given how tightly harmonized so many of the other product categories we've covered on this channel actually are. This is worth sitting with for a second because it cuts against the pattern viewers of this channel might reasonably have started to expect by now. Ice cream is one of the clearer examples where the United States, not the European Union, built the more rigid, more centrally enforced, more legally binding compositional floor, specifically because United States regulators decided decades ago that a product this popular and this price sensitive needed a hard federal standard to prevent exactly the kind of air and cheap fat cost cutting that a less regulated market might otherwise drift toward. Europe's more fragmented, member state driven approach does not necessarily mean European ice cream is lower quality. In practice, European ice cream and gelato traditions carry their own strong quality expectations, often enforced more through culinary tradition, competitive market pressure, and national consumer protection law than through one centralized compositional rule. It is just a genuinely different regulatory structure, without the same single, uniform federal number backing it up the way United States ice cream has. While we're on the topic, it's worth mentioning gelato specifically because it's a great example of how a related frozen dessert category can differ from American ice cream for reasons that have nothing to do with regulation at all. Traditional Italian gelato typically contains meaningfully less milk fat than American ice cream, often somewhere in a noticeably lower range, and is churned with far less overrun, meaning much less air incorporated during freezing, which produces a dense, more intensely flavored product served slightly warmer than typical ice cream to keep that dense texture soft and scoopable. This isn't a legal compositional standard the way the US ice cream rule is. It's a culinary and cultural tradition developed over centuries of Italian dessert-making practice that happens to produce a genuinely different product from American ice cream, even without any regulatory body mandating the difference the way the FDA does domestically. So, practically, here's what you can actually check the next time you are standing in the frozen aisle. First, check the package for the actual category word being used. Ice cream on its own, without a qualifier, means the product has met the FDA's full 10% milk fat and weight per gallon requirements. Frozen dairy dessert, reduced fat, light or low fat ice cream all signal that the product falls short of the full standard in some specific labeled way, not necessarily a lower quality product, but a legally distinct one from full standard ice cream. Second, check the nutrition label directly for grams of fat per serving if milk fat content specifically matters to you, since the category name alone tells you whether a legal minimum was met but not exactly how far above that minimum a specific premium product actually sits. Third, if you want a genuinely useful, low-effort way to compare overrun and density between two products without any special tools, the pint weighing trick actually works. A denser, lower overrun product will weigh noticeably more than a higher overrun product of the identical stated volume. And it's a surprisingly reliable, immediately checkable signal of how much air versus actual ice cream you're really buying. This channel compares food and product standards across the US, the UK, and the EU using publicly available regulatory information, including the FDA's Standard of Identity for Ice Cream under 21 CFR 135.110, state-level mellorine regulations, and EU General Food Information Labeling requirements. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Regulations and product formulations change over time. So always check current labels and official sources for yourself. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by any brand, company, or organization mentioned. Next time, we're heading into an entirely different kind of question: the genetically modified corn hiding in almost every bag of US tortillas, and why the EU's approval process for that same crop looks nothing like America's. Subscribe if you want to see exactly how different those two systems really are.